Welcome and thank you for coming to my talk. My name is Kayla Fratt and I'm one of the co-founders of Canine Conservationists. We train dogs to detect data. Today, I want to talk to you all about the concept of compassionate conservation and how detection dogs fit into that framework. We'll start out with some definitions, and then we'll talk about how conservation detection dogs can fit into a framework of compassionate conservation and how study design, careful selection, and training of dogs and dog teams can promote all of these goals. So let's get to it. Compassionate conservation is an ethical framework and emerging movement within conservation science. It takes into account the research on animal emotion and cognition to promote an empathetic practice in conservation. Compassionate conservation requires taking into account the experience of each individual animal and damage to individual plants, not just the greater good of the species or the ecosystem. It is rooted in principles of first, do no harm. And as with any ethical framework, it can be subjective and it can go a little bit further than some of us are comfortable with. But I personally am broadly supportive of the compassionate conservation movement and the framework it provides, which is why I'm here today. Conservation detection dogs can be an incredibly powerful tool for conservation, as you'll be learning throughout the symposium. Detection dogs are emerging biosensors with the capacity to be non-invasive. However, they take careful selection and training and good study design in order to meet that goal. As anyone who's seen dogs chasing wildlife can attest, dogs are not inherently non-invasive. And of course, it's practically impossible to be 100% non-invasive when we're really doing boots on the ground fieldwork. Just by observing and entering an ecosystem, we become part of it and influence it. And it is an honor to work in fragile ecosystems and around sensitive species. I think we all take that very seriously. That said, there are some special considerations with dogs. There are studies that show that the movement of dogs, even when they're on leash and under control, can elevate the heart rate of bighorn sheep or disturb migratory birds. Just moving a dog through the landscape and leaving its odor behind can change the behavior of wildlife. But the same can be said for humans who are moving through walking transects, checking camera traps, or setting hair traps. Conservation detection dogs can be excellent at gathering lots of hard-to-find data points with minimal disturbance to the plants and animals that we study. And in comparison with other methods, conservation detection dogs do fit into the realm of non-invasive sampling. As I mentioned, human-only searchers can also affect wildlife behavior or harm sensitive plants. Conservation detection dogs are generally more effective and sensitive than human-only searchers, which may mean that you can perform fewer but more fruitful surveys, which reduce the impact on the environment over time. Conservation detection dogs can also precisely target invasive plants, reducing the need for widespread removal efforts that harm native ecosystems as well. By gathering scat samples after an animal has left the area, conservation detection dogs are less invasive for hormonal or genetic data collection than trapping or darting an animal in order to get a blood or saliva sample. Conservation dog practitioners also recognize that dogs are living beings and deserve their own compassionate care and training. Many of us extend the concepts of compassionate conservation into the training of our conservation detection dogs. Many of us rely on a dog training framework known as the humane hierarchy to train our dogs. But first, we've got to select the right dog for the job. This starts with careful screening to identify dogs that are not likely to chase or harass wildlife and have the energy and drive to do this work. We test prospective dogs for their desire to sniff, their response to wildlife and livestock, and their interest in partnering with us. Once we've got a dog on the team, we start with the humane hierarchy's first step of wellness. We ensure that our detection dogs are well cared for, well rested, and behaviorally and physically sound. Happy, healthy dogs with adequate opportunities to perform species-appropriate behaviors are more able to respond and learn in the dynamic environment we expect them to work in. Next up, the humane hierarchy considers antecedent arrangement. In biology, we may call this study design. Rather than sending our dogs off-leash into a colony of terns during peak fledging time, we may utilize the dogs to locate carcasses far from the colony for necropsy. We can also choose to deploy dog teams during a specific time of day or specific season where they're less likely to cause harmful impacts to the plants or animals in a given area. We also often choose to work the dogs on leashes or even wearing muzzles to ensure that the teams are really set up for success and to do no harm. The reality is, not every study is a good fit for conservation dogs, and the expertise and reliability of detection dog trainers for wildlife safety in particular varies widely. When considering using a conservation detection dog team for a project, researchers need to consider the search areas the dogs will work in, time of day, and seasonality to reduce the impact of dogs on the ecosystem. They also need to carefully interview prospective conservation dog teams on their level of expertise and training on safe animal interactions. Next, we work through positive reinforcement to teach our dogs what we want them to do, which is to locate a given odor, take us to that odor, and sit back to alert us to the location without disturbing it. We also use positive reinforcement to teach the dogs to automatically check in with us when they notice wildlife, to turn on a dime if we call them away from a fledgling bird, or to drop in place when we see a snake. We may even teach them to use directional cues in order to help them avoid a jackrabbit that we see before they do. Using positive reinforcement is the gold standard in dog training and allows us to teach the dogs what to do while keeping all aspects of their important job fun and clear. The next step in the humane hierarchy is known as differential reinforcement, which I'll avoid going into too much detail on here because it gets a little bit technical. But a good example in the conservation dog world is that we heavily reward our dogs for the good but hard choices we ask them to make in the field. Responsible conservation dog trainers adhering to the humane hierarchy take care to consult with other experts before embarking on training plans that involve punishing the dog for unwanted behaviors. If we feel that a dog is struggling to behave appropriately on site or regarding wildlife, we go back to the drawing board with study design, dog project fit, and our training plan long before we compromise the dog's sense of trust and safety with an aversive training technique. Study after study has shown that turning to punishment-based training compromises dogs' welfare and their trust in humans. Worse, it can often backfire and create aggressive, avoidant, and fearful responses. This is especially important when considering a community science or volunteer approach to utilizing conservation detection dogs. While many dogs can be trained to locate given species and sniff out a given odor, this is not the only consideration before hiring a dog team. I'd like to round out this presentation with a case study of a scat dog team we recently consulted with. Throughout spring of 2022, the Canine Conservationist team took turns flying to Kenya to mentor the cheetah scat detection dog teams with Action for Cheetahs in Kenya. We quickly realized that one of their stellar conservation detection dogs, Percy, had some work to do to make her a less invasive member of the team. She desperately wanted to chase rock hyraxes and dik-diks and geranooks, making surveys stressful for her handlers and potentially risky for the local wildlife. This is also a potentially deadly behavior for her. Elephants, puff adders, hyenas, and a lot of the other big animals in Kenya can and will kill dogs. So we started out with an approach of improving Percy's relationship with her handlers and improving their communication skills. We practiced heavily rewarding her for coming when called around these temptations and for checking in with whoever's holding her leash around these distractions. We wanted her to know that both listening to us and focusing on her target odor was way more fun and worth her time compared to chasing wildlife. We also improved the human half of the team's skill with handling long lines and tweaked their survey strategy to reduce the likelihood of Percy coming into contact with wildlife during a search. All of this was with the goal of advancing the entire team towards less invasive sampling and compassionate conservation. Finally, we started training Percy regularly near the animals that frequented field camp by using the hyraxes and hornbills and porcupines that come to camp daily as volunteers for her to ignore and work near. Over the course of just a few weeks of training, Percy dramatically improved in her focus and trustworthiness and safety on searches. So that's all we have time for. I hope I left you with some things to think about, some things to discuss, and you're feeling excited to learn more about conservation detection dogs and/or compassionate conservation and how these things fit together. If you're interested in staying in touch or learning more, you can find us at canineconservationists.org. I also run a weekly podcast all about conservation detection dogs, so you can check that out wherever podcasts are found. You can find me on Twitter and all of the other social medias. I love connecting and would be thrilled to hear from you.